My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We're looking at Romans chapter 8 in comparison with 1 Corinthians 15. Paul's doctrine of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 is Paul's doctrine of the body and life and resurrection in Romans chapter 8. However, as we have shown, Paul's doctrine of the body, Paul's doctrine of the flesh, Paul's doctrine of resurrection in Romans chapter 8 absolutely is not dealing with physical flesh and blood. Paul in Romans chapter 8 says, those who are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God. Well, if he's talking about biological flesh, then that means you and I, no matter how much we love the Lord, no matter how much we want to be with Him, we can't please Him, period. Because after all, we're in flesh. But that's directly parallel to 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 52, where Paul said, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. Directly parallel passages. Now, since Paul said, if you're in the flesh, you cannot please God, and flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, or enter the kingdom of God, but Paul's discussion of flesh in Romans 8 has nothing to do with biological bodies. What does that mean in 1 Corinthians 15? It means that Paul is not talking about the transformation of biological human bodies in order to enter heaven. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom. Directly parallel passages, but in the flesh in Romans is not biological flesh. Therefore, when Paul says flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom, he is not saying you have to put off a biologically flesh body in order to enter the kingdom, which, by the way, would kind of mess up the traditional view anyway that says, oh, wait, we got to have a physical resurrection. Okay, if we have to have physical resurrection in order to go to heaven, then we have to have a physical resurrection of that which cannot enter heaven. Paul says flesh and blood does not enter heaven. And people say, well, okay, it's transformed. Okay, that's fine. What is Paul talking about in Romans 8? What is he talking about in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says to put off the mind of flesh? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, wait a minute. The mind is that which was either a mind of flesh or a mind of the Spirit. And thus Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, let's remember to go back over what I shared with you in the last video. Just like Paul in Romans chapter 8 says, if you're in the flesh, you cannot be pleasing to God. And just like Paul said, flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom. Just like Paul urged the Romans to put off the mind of flesh, Paul said, we have borne, aorist, active indicative, again, if memory serves me correctly, as we have borne the image of the earthly, let us, it's in the subjunctive mode, folks, in the Greek, in the majority of texts. Now, the subjunctive means that Paul was saying to the Corinthians, it was their responsibility to put on the image of the heavenly. That's directly parallel to Romans chapter 8. Put off the mind of flesh, put on the mind of the Spirit. You've borne the image of the earthly, of the man of the dust. Now put on the image of the heavenly. But once again, Paul's not dealing with biological bodies. And that is driven home, once again, when Paul says, Romans 8 verse 9, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. I cannot overemphasize enough that Paul's statement here is a direct contradiction of the traditional view of flesh, of the necessity for a physical resurrection. Paul says, no, you have to put off the flesh. But he's not saying you have to put off your physical body. He was saying you have to stop living according to the flesh. You have to stop living a life contrary to the will of God. You have to stop living your lives dedicated in submission to, devoted to sin, the sting of death. Put off sin. Because when you deal with sin, you deal with death. And thus you're not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit, if the Spirit of Christ dwells in you. You see, having the mind of Christ, which was a mind of obedience and submission, and the love of God, the love of everything righteous and holy and pure. Philippians chapter 4, 6 and following. That mind of obedience and submission and holiness and righteousness, that mind is the life, and it is the mind of the Spirit versus the life of the flesh.